What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. For years, the Kremlin's entire war strategy has relied not only on weapons, pressure, propaganda and censorship, but on something much simpler and much uglier. Simple geography. Russia is so absurdly huge, so scattered, #1 biggest country in the world, and so disconnected from itself at the same time, that one region can live in a completely different reality from another. And that is exactly why the authorities have been able to drag this catastrophe on for so long, without the whole country fully feeling and understanding all this at once. One town buries its sons in silence, another signs more contracts because it has no jobs, a third barely even understands what is happening beyond TV slogans, and Moscow at the same time keeps pretending the machine is still functioning completely normally, somewhere far away from them. But here is the part that matters now. That insulation may finally be starting to crack, because in spring of 2026, after more than 4 years of full-scale war, even some of the loudest pro-war voices have started doing one thing they were never supposed to do, which is simple middle school math. And once people begin calculating, once the abstraction turns into cities worth of thousands of missing men, once the number stops being just a lot and starts becoming the entire town or city of Ivanovo, Bryansk, Kaluga, Belgorod or Smolensk, the political atmosphere changes in a way that not any single slogan can fully control. Let's talk about this problem for Russia in today's video. Let me tell you the real starting point of this story, because without it, nothing else makes sense. Russia is a country of gigantic distances, the kind of distances that do not just separate cities, but separate realities, habits, expectations, and even entire ways of life. For many Russians traveling across the country, it is inconvenient, exhausting, and unaffordable, which means that neighboring regions are often perceived almost like just literally foreign states, and sometimes not even metaphorically, it's literally. Users on Avito, this is like Russian website where you can buy stuff, literally ask whether certain Russian services deliver to Kalmykia, while people from Bashkiria, for example, still have to remind landlords and even officials that Bashkirs are Russian citizens. Just think about how insane that is for a country that constantly lectures others, the rest of the world, about unity, sovereignty, civilizational greatness, and historical destiny. And it gets even darker when you move away from the showcase cities. A resident of Moscow, St. Petersburg, or even Kazan may have absolutely no clue what life looks like in a provincial single-industry town. And even that provincial town may still be far better off than the truly forgotten corners of the country. Take Novotroitsk, for example, population 70,000 people. Gloomy, provincial, unglamorous. The kind of place nobody on state television wants to romanticize unless they are filming some kind of fake patriotic documentary. And yet even Novotroitsk looks privileged compared to the real outskirts of the country, because at least it has sewers, paved streets, trams, ambulances, hospitals, even internet cables. In other words, even the depressing tier of Russia still stands above the blind spots, those invisible places from which almost no news comes at all and where people survive like they are living on completely isolated islands. And that is exactly why after February 24, 2022, the state could afford to waste people by the truckload and bury the fact across the map. Losses were not felt in one central square, one social class, one city or one visible national conversation. No, they were just simply diluted across more than 80 regions and those regions who even barely speak to one another, barely even understand one another, and even barely see one another. The size of the country became the political shield. The war got bloodier every year, even the yet system kept functioning, because the damage was distributed, compartmentalized, and disguised as local tragedy rather than just a national collapse. That is the key mechanism here. The same vastness that propaganda sells as civilizational grandeur has become the perfect cover for a grinding national disaster. A centralized authoritarian state ruling over a fragmented social landscape can keep consuming its own people much longer than a smaller, more connected country ever could afford. But this only works up to a point, because once enough losses accumulate, once enough coffins, disappearances and broken families pile up, geography stops helping and starts betraying the regime. And that is where the next part of the story becomes much more dangerous for the Kremlin. because once people stop treating the losses as just some kind of distant background noise and begin trying to measure them, the illusion of control starts to weaken. And that is exactly what we need to talk about next, in our next chapter. By the way, as always, there is an additional chapter for our Patreon members, and today we will talk about some ridiculous Russian propaganda. Please check the link down below for our Patreon if you want to get some additional content and early access to the episodes. Thanks so much, now let's continue. Here's where things get, I guess, interesting. Because in any war, the numbers are just never numbers. There are political weapons, emotional triggers, ideological tools, and authoritarian systems that are often treated almost like state secrets wrapped in just ritual language. Human losses are one of the most sensitive and manipulated categories imaginable, and this is true even decades after wars are over. For example, Stalin in 1946 interview with Pravda Gazeta claimed that the Soviet Union lost about 7 million killed in the Second World War, including both servicemen and civilians, which was grotesquely understated, as many of you imagine, yet even that absurd estimate remained official for roughly a decade. Then de-Stalinization came, the number jumped suddenly to 20 million, and later rose more or less to the official number we know today, 27 million people. Same country, same war, wildly different numbers, because the number was never just about the truth, it was about what the regime at a given moment was willing to admit. Now look at the current war. Officially, the Russian Ministry of Defense still recognizes the demise of 5,937 Russian servicemen, a number proposed by Sergei Shoigu back in 2022. That's it, literally. Just think about how ridiculous is this. It is the end of April 2026, Shoigu is gone, Andrei Belousov is new defense minister, 4+ years of full-scale war have passed, and yet the formal public estimate remains frozen in time like some bureaucratic fossil from completely another universe. The state does not really update Russian losses, because acknowledging them, honestly, would demolish too many myths at once. Instead, the ministry under Belousov keeps reporting Ukrainian losses. According to the version published by Rossiyskaya Gazeta, the Russian government's own newspaper, by the way, the armed forces of Ukraine have supposedly lost 1.5 million killed. TASS interprets the very same figure differently and says that, yes, it is 1.5 million, but it also includes wounded people as well. Once again, for comparison reasons, Russia claims to have officially lost 5,937, that's it. Even here in the propaganda narrative itself there is confusion, contradiction and convenient fog. But that barely matters to the system, because the real goal is not precision, it is just simply focus. The focus must always remain on the enemy's losses, never on your own. And for years, that worked beautifully for the war camp. Military bloggers, Z-propagandists, Telegram channels affiliated with the Russian military, puppet military analysts, pretty much everyone who supported Kremlin one way or another, and their deeply loyal audiences even, all became extremely generous when adding zeros to Ukrainian casualty claims, while Russian losses were treated as just some abstract, undefined, almost just mystical category. Yes, they sometimes complained about heavy Russian losses, but usually just in the style of emotional whining, not actual counting. They were saying things like a lot was acceptable, huge was acceptable, too many was even acceptable. But yeah, obviously the exact numbers were always way too dangerous to pronounce. That is why the article by Alexei Podberezkin is so revealing. This is the head of military and political studies at Moscow University MGIMO, a person with a PhD, someone who is presented as a respectable expert. And in his article called Approximate Losses of Both Sides During the Special Military Operation, he calculates Ukrainian losses with theatrical confidence, calling the armed forces of Ukraine the army of Banderlog, and claiming that the Ukraine lost more than 4,000 tanks, tens of thousands of armored vehicles, and more than 70,000 soldiers just during the Kursk operation alone of August 2024. Meanwhile, when it comes to Russian losses, he's interested not in dead Russians, not in the dead soldiers, not even in missing soldiers, not even, guess what, in wounded soldiers, but just in the number of intercepted Russian missiles. That's it. That is the level of moral and analytical emptiness here. And the expert references behind this performance, Proza.ru and Yandex.Zen, both under heavily controlled by the FSB. I mean, that's not analysis, that's propaganda theater wearing a lab coat. For a long time this was the deal, count Ukrainians in extravagant quantities, treat Russian losses as just vapor and move on as quick as possible. But propaganda has a very big weakness. Eventually, the math becomes too large even for the loyalists to ignore, and once the taboo on counting starts to break, the whole discussion enters a brand new phase, which is exactly what happened when even some of the most radical pro-war voices started picking up calculators and finally seeing the truth with their own eyes. Let's talk about now, in our next chapter. Here is the surprising part. The pressure did not first break through the official institutions or even through the most mainstream propagandists, but through parts of the war camp itself. That is what makes this moment so important. Back in summer 2025, Pavel Gubaryov, the so-called people's governor of Donetsk, elected by nobody, supported by no one, said that Russian losses had reached the limit beyond which the war should end. Gubaryov, of course, is not some soft liberal critic discovering humanitarian principles. No, he's a radical voice. But the fact that even someone like him framed losses as a limiting factor mattered, because it hinted that the emotional ceiling inside pro-war circles was no longer infinite. Still, Gubaryov was more exception than a trend, unfortunately. Most Z-propagandists kept speaking the vague terms: Russia has lost a lot, the army had paid a huge price, the campaign was costly, but nobody wanted to define the actual phrase. After all, technically 5,937 is also a lot, depending on how you look at that. The whole trick was just to simply keep language emotional and just imprecise. Then early 2026 arrived, and something shifted. By that point, the full-scale invasion had outlasted the Eastern Front action of the Second World War. And symbolically that mattered. Day 1418 hit hard specifically, because it invited comparison not just with another year of war, but with the foundational myth of the Soviet victory cult itself. And right around that symbolic threshold, some pro-war actors did something that should have absolutely never been necessary in a functioning country. Once again, they started simply counting and drawing conclusions. For example, the neo-Nazi Rusich group's Telegram channel laid out the rough arithmetic, one of the very first ones. According to official data, 540,000 people signed contracts with the Russian army in 2023 alone, followed by 440,000 in 2024 and 400,000 in 2025. Add to that more than 300,000 mobilized Russians, add tens of thousands for private military companies, add active personnel already present at the beginning of the invasion, which Rusich estimates at approximately 700,000, and then put all of that together and compare it with the officially visible size of the Russian military in Ukraine, and suddenly you get an enormous gap, almost 1.5 million people completely unaccounted for. Just a very basic, rough accounting mistake, I would say. Now, obviously, this arithmetic is not perfect. Some people may be counted multiple times. Mobilized personnel, for example, are often forced to sign contracts under threat of violent punishment, something so common that even state TV employees have mentioned it several times, or former private military companies fighters later joining the regular army, which now pretty much can also mean that they appear twice on the totals. So, long story short, the Rusich number is, yes, messy, rough, and methodologically not verifiable, but that is not the main point. The main point is that the pro-war channel crossed the line from emotional commentary into explicitly counting, and that once line is crossed, the political atmosphere completely changes. Then came Yuri Podolyaka, probably the most famous Russian pro-war blogger with approximately 3 million subscribers. And no, a giant audience does not magically make him competent, obviously. His work is often just a swamp of assumptions, exaggerations, and absurd Microsoft Paint and PowerPoint doodles. But still, influence does matter, and what he did matters even more. Podolyaka estimated that roughly 2 million Russians, Donbas residents, and recruited foreign nationals have fought against Ukraine, and that between 315,000 and 415,000 have been killed. Once again, focus and hear and read that again. Over 300,000 killed. A figure that had previously been associated mostly with opposition media suddenly got pronounced by one of the most recognizable faces in the pro-war informational ecosystem. That's obviously not a minor detail, that is a crack in the wall. And it gets even more ironic when you compare it with the state propaganda itself. Российская Gazeta, once again, wrote about 1.5 million dead Ukrainian soldiers, and Putin once said Ukrainian forces suffered losses 5 times larger than Russian forces. Now we just simply use middle school math. So if you actually apply that ratio, you land suspiciously close to, guess what, 300,000 Russians killed. So even the regime's own exaggerations, when put through their own dishonest formula, confirm the same horrifying result. In other words, the taboo is not being broken by moral awakening. It is being broken by accumulated contradiction. Too many contracts, too many mobilized, too many missing, too many funerals, too many destroyed lives, and too many just years of war. The machine has been grinding so long that even some of its own operators are beginning to hear the noise, and once that noise becomes a number, a specific number, the next question becomes pretty much unavoidable. What does this 300,000 actually mean for a country like Russia? Let's answer this in the next chapter. Now imagine this, because this is where abstract statistics finally become human. Russia has plenty of cities with population above 300,000. Ivanovo, which we mentioned earlier, Bryansk, Kaluga, Belgrade, Smolensk, and many others. So when we talk about 300,000 plus killed, we're no longer just talking about some sterile figure floating above the battlefield. We're talking about the entire Russian regional center disappearing over the course of just 4 years. Not because of a natural disaster, not because of a plague, not while repelling an invasion from abroad, no, but because one single man launched a war nobody but Putin needed. A war that offered no meaningful gain and only expanded the menu of tragedy. And this is precisely why the geography issue matters so much. Those losses are not concentrated in one place. If one city vanished all at once, the political shock would be impossible to contain. But when the losses are spread across remote villages, industrial towns, ethnic republics, outskirts, contract armies, mobilized units, prisons, private military companies, and poor regions with weak media visibility, the state can simply keep pretending that the national center is still calm. It is pretty much the same old imperial principles. Peripheral lives are easier to spend, easier to hide, and just easier to narrate as acceptable sacrifices. But guess what? This graph only moves one way. This is not a currency rate that dips, recovers, reassures investors. No, the number of killed and missing cannot spontaneously improve tomorrow morning, because the television presenter smiled more confidently. No, the casualties graph always goes up and never down. Every month adds weight, every contract signed under poverty adds risk, every family that receives terrible news adds pressure, every village cemetery expands the truth in physical form. And that is why the question, when will it all end, is becoming more palpable. More people ask this, at least in their own heads. For a while, duration alone was enough to strain public patience. 4 years is long enough time for any war, especially one sold as a quick 3-day special military operation. But now duration is blending with bloodshed and pointlessness. That is the dangerous mix. Too long on its own can be managed, too bloody on its own can be euphemized. Absolutely pointless on its own can be suppressed with slogans. But when all three begin reinforcing one another, the state enters much riskier territory. This is also why treating Podolyaka's video as some magical revelation point misses the point. He did not expose a classified secret from inside a bunker. He counted out loud, and that was it. But sometimes the political event is not the discovery of the truth. Sometimes the event is that a mass audience hears the truth-shaped numbers spoken in its own camp for the first time. In authoritarian systems, repetition matters way more than novelty. The secret has already been there in funerals, absences, contracts, mobilization, and missing men. What simply changed is that more people were suddenly invited to connect the dots. And when an entire city's worth of men starts hovering over the public conversation like an unburied fact, it becomes much harder to keep the war framed as just some kind of distant necessity. The human cost starts demanding interpretation, and that is where the Kremlin faces a deeper, much deeper problem. Because once people ask not only when it ends, but how much it had already cost them, the discussion stops just being simply tactical and becomes existential. Let's talk about why 2026 might be different for Russia finally, in our final chapter. Here's the one thing no one tells you. In closed systems, public opinion often arrives late, unevenly, and through some strange side doors. You do not get clean nationwide catharsis. You get hints, fragments, irritations, symbolic moments, awkward posts, notice overreactions, and people saying that the unsayable a little bit too loudly. Russia is a country where freedom of speech is outlawed, so anyone trying to understand public mood is forced to rely on just fuzzy words like feeling, impression, and atmosphere. And that makes the analysis extremely risky. It is very easy to overestimate a petty incident or mistake a Telegram argument for a historic turning point, and yet some themes are simply too fundamental to stay buried forever. The topic of human losses is just simply one of them. Because unlike ideology, unlike ratings, television narratives, unlike military maps presented with dramatic music, the losses enter daily life and they stay there for a very long time, if not forever. They enter apartment blocks, kitchens, village roads, train stations, military offices, funeral notices, even school classrooms and family conversations. They do not remain just theoretical. This war lasted 4 full years and counting. 4 years of recruitment drives, mobilization pressure, contract propaganda, patriotic fantasies, local poverty feeding the army, and endless attempts to convince people that the war is both normal and necessary. But the longer it goes on, the more fragile that narrative becomes. Not because everyone suddenly turns brave, and not because the state becomes humane. Not especially Kremlin, obviously. But because math is simply persistent and the grief is cumulative. That is why 2026 may become the year when the issue of losses moves from background discomfort to central political question. And the Kremlin understands that this danger, obviously better than many observers do, that is the center to their existence. That is why it still clings to the fossilized figure of 5,937. That is why its institutions prefer fantasy statistics about 1.5 million Ukrainian losses. That is why propagandists keep trying to flood the information space with enemy numbers, glorious language, and civilizational nonsense. Because once Russians focus seriously on Russian losses, once the national conversation starts orbiting around the price paid rather than the slogans shouted, the emotional logic of the war begins to collapse completely. This does not mean that the system falls tomorrow, unfortunately, obviously. It does not mean that the war ends automatically. It does not even mean that Russian society suddenly becomes healthy or honest. But it does mean that the old formula of distance plus silence plus abstraction may finally be wearing out. And for a regime that has relied on hiding tragedy across a gigantic map, that is a very dangerous development. So yeah, guys, if you found this video essay interesting, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and like this video. Don't forget about our Patreon, the link is down below, and the additional chapter that we will talk about there right now. Thank you so much, see you on Friday.
We won't succumb to their tricks, the facade they try to sell. Their twisted words and feeble claims on us all they cannot quell. We see through their lies, their feeble attempts to sway. We do not believe in ridiculous Russian propaganda.